Okay, hi everybody. I understand we have some visitors, and welcome. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about the Parsha that's coming up. And those of you who come from outside of Israel know you're a Parsha behind, but eventually you will catch up. And this is the Parshas Chukas. And Chukas has a number of interesting things that happen. But the mitzvah that's introduced is considered to be the most enigmatic, mysterious mitzvah of the Torah. And this is the mitzvah of what is called the red heifer, or the red cow, the Parah Aduma. And we are told to prepare a red cow, to slaughter it, to then burn it into ashes, and mix the ashes with spring water. And when a person has come in contact with a dead body, and they are called ritually impure for 7 days, they're not allowed to enter the temple. If they are sprinkled with a mixture of the ashes and the spring water on day 3 and on day 7, just a little sprinkling, then they go to a whole mikvah on day 7, and then at night they will be pure. Now, it's interesting. I always thought, as growing up as a kid, I learned this for the first time, so I always imagined a Parah Aduma as a fire engine red. A cow, which is really rare, you wouldn't expect that, it doesn't exist. In reality, the color of Parah Aduma is not so rare. It is the typical orange-brown that many cows have. But the reason why the Parah Aduma was rare is it had to be virtually 100% of that color. You're allowed to have up to 1 black hair or 1 white hair. If there are 2, it's already not eligible. So when they had to make a Parah Aduma, and there have only been 10 Parah Adumas from the beginning till it got discontinued, and the ashes of the last one will be re-revealed when Mashiach comes. But whenever they had to make a new one, they'd have to have somebody sit with a magnifying glass, hair by hair by hair by hair by hair. Because of this, Parah Adumas were very expensive. And the Gemara even gives us a beautiful story about, in the Gemara in Kedushin discusses the mitzvah of honoring your father and mother. And it uses as the example of the person who honored his parents to a great degree, the example of a non-Jew. It's willing to look at a non-Jew as an exemplar of honoring parents. And this was a man whose name was Dama ben Netina. He lived in Ashkelon. And it mentions 2 stories that are related. Story number 1 is that, the Kohen Gadol had a breastplate that had precious jewels in it, and one time one of the jewels was lost. And the one that had the suitable replacement was Dama ben Netina. And the sages went to him to negotiate for the purchase of this jewel. And the problem was that the key to the jewelry case was under his father's pillow, and his father was sleeping. He refused to wake up his father, even though he lost the sale of that jewel, because of honoring father and mother. So the Talmud says God rewarded him the next year that he had a Parah Aduma in his flock, and he was able to make a lot of money by selling it to the Beis HaMikdash. First of all, that first part of the story, though, is very, very interesting. He is praised because he refused to wake up his dad to get the key, even though they lost a huge sale. Now, let's imagine what that would work. Let's imagine that somebody offers you like $5 million for something, but you'd have to wake up your father to be able to get the paper or whatever it is. And you decide, I honor my father so much that I am not going to wake him up. So dad wakes up, 2 hours later, and he says, Dad, I just want to know how much I value you. We lost $5 million because I didn't want to wake you up. Now, is your father going to be happy? Or is your father going to kind of say, you are the stupidest kid, How did I raise such a stupid idiot? So the truth of the matter is, halachically, you probably should wake up your father. The Gemara does not mean to suggest that Dama ben Netina did the right thing. He actually did the wrong thing. But the point was, his motives were so pure. He was willing to give up $5 million out of honor for his father. So even though practically that was not the right decision to make, he is praised because of the purity of his intention. Okay, but be it as it may, Act 2 was he was given the Parah Aduma as a reward. Now, every once in a while, maybe you've seen this in the newspapers or on the internet, People claim to have a red heifer in their flock. Sometimes it's Christians, fundamentalist Christians who believe in the Bible. They'll say, we have a red heifer, and the like. And that actually gets people excited. Gets Jews excited. Because when you have a red heifer, that means maybe we're approaching Mashiach and we'll be able to rebuild the temple and everything else. Usually it pans out that there's a black hair or there's something. And by the way, it's very, very easy to make the red heifer invalid. Because the halacha is, if it did any work at all, if you put any type of burden on it, it becomes disqualified. So if I simply, let's assume I'm milking the cow, and I throw my jacket over the cow, I throw my coat over the cow, it's no longer kosher for Parah Aduma because there can't be any work that is done. So you got to be very careful in terms of how you handle it. Okay. So the burning of the red heifer and the mixing of it with spring water is a necessary prerequisite to become purified from the contamination of death. What that means practically, that has some very practical repercussions. Today, we don't have the ritual of the red heifer. Either we don't have the red heifer or we're not able to prepare it. So that actually means any person who was ever in a cemetery in your life, you remain, all of us remain, perpetually in a state of impurity because we don't have the purification ritual of Parah Aduma. Now, what does that mean practically? Practically, it doesn't mean that much. Even if I'm ritually impure, I keep Shabbos, I keep kosher, I learn Torah, I daven, meaning I can walk around through in life and be ritually impure. That doesn't stop me from doing commandments. Just a fact of life. But when you are ritually impure, you are not allowed to enter the temple. You're not allowed to enter the temple grounds. And that actually explains why most Orthodox Jews, not all, do not enter the Temple Mount. Right? We go up to the Western Wall. We don't go on the other side where the Muslims have their mosques and the like. Now, in reality, when people say the holiest place in Jerusalem is the Western Wall, that's not really true. The Temple Mount is holier than the Western Wall. That's where the Holy of Holies is. That's where the altar would have been. That's where the temple was. But we don't enter it because a person that is ritually impure by contact with the dead is not allowed to enter the temple area. And since all of us have that ritual impurity because we don't have the ashes of the Parah Aduma, the red heifer, so we don't go. Now, even those who go, they simply maintain that the outer perimeter of the Temple Mount is not yet the temple area. In other words, you kind of have to superimpose the temple over that area, and there's a lot of uncertainty how to superimpose that. So some are more confident in their identification, and they will tell you go here and don't go here. Others look at it like a minefield. Let's imagine you had a field that had live mines, and someone says, well, listen, just stay 3 inches away from that line and you're going to be okay. Well, I mean, I think most of us wouldn't feel that secure to walk within a few inches of a live mine. So most halachic authorities say just don't go there. Others are a bit more confident. So that's a live controversy. But it's not really a machlokas in principle. It's simply a machlokas in how cautious you want to be. Okay. So Parah Aduma, right, red heifer, I'll call it Parah Aduma, is said to be the most mysterious of God's laws. But what makes it, and that even King Solomon, who understood the whole Torah, when he got to this one, he was stuck. Although there is a tradition that Korach of last week actually understood the Parah Aduma, whatever that means exactly. So the commentaries explain that what is enigmatic about Parah Aduma is not simply why a red cow and all the details. I mean, there are many commandments that we don't really get all the details. But the real problem of Parah Aduma is that it embodies within itself a contradiction, a paradox. And that is the following. It purifies those who are impure. So if I've come in contact with a dead body, I get sprinkled with the ashes and the water of the Parah Aduma twice, day 3 and day 7. That purifies me. And yet, all the people who handle the ashes, who carry the ashes, who are involved in the burning of the cow, they become impure by virtue of their connection to the Parah Aduma. So that is what is so enigmatic. How can the same thing that purifies those who are impure, how can it contaminate those who are pure? Right? This is contradiction. This is paradox. Now, people ask the question, just want to address a certain question, which is really a false question, but people raise the question. When the temple comes, God wants all of us to be in a state of purity. And so there'll be the Parah Aduma, there'll be the ritual sprinkling. Question is, if everybody who handles it becomes tamei, it seems it's impossible for some people not to be left over. I mean, here's the example. We have the Parah Aduma. So you're all impure, so let's assume I sprinkle it on you, you guys are pure. But now I'm impure. So I got to find somebody to sprinkle it on me. Okay, he sprinkles it on me. I'm pure, but now he's impure. So somebody's going to be left holding the bag. How do you get everybody to be pure? Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
I would ask, it should be a different type of impurity, the one that you receive from using the ashes of the...
Yeah.
And the one that is mace, it's a different...
Right. Yeah, that's very correct. That's very true. You have to understand this. The need to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Parah Aduma is only for one specific type of impurity, impurity by contact with a dead body. Now, there happens to be 3 different ways, by the way, you can become impure by contact with a dead body. One is by touching a dead body. Most of us generally don't do that. The other is by moving a dead body, even if you didn't touch it, like you carry it in a coffin. Again, unless you're an undertaker, we usually don't do that. The third way, though, is where we get in trouble, and that's if you're under the same roof. Let's say, God forbid, there would be a dead body here. Even if I didn't touch it, I'm under the same roof. All of us are ritually impure. So if you go to a funeral and there's a eulogy in a synagogue or whatever it is, we're all impure. Even if there's a tree that overhangs a grave and me, that's a common roof. So be it as it may, whether I become tamei by touching, or whether I become tamei by moving, or whether I become tamei by common roof, that is when I need the sprinkling of the ashes of the Parah Aduma. But if I become tamei not because I was in contact with a dead body, I become tamei because I handled the ashes of Parah Aduma, that's another type of impurity. That impurity, all you need is to go to the mikveh. So the last guy holding the bag jumps into the mikveh, and they're going to be pure. Okay, in other words, you're not going to have this problem of infinite regression because the other people don't need to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Parah Aduma. But this is the famous paradox of the Parah Aduma in the language of Chazal, mitaher es atmeim. It purifies those who are tamei, impure, umitaher, and mitamei es atahorim, and it contaminates those who are impure. And this is a paradox. How can the same thing work in opposite directions? So what's interesting is that although this is a paradox, and although obviously even King Solomon, the wisest of all people, didn't understand this, the commentaries try to give you some type of glimpse as to what it might mean. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts from some of the Hasidic writers. First of all, let's examine generally the concept of purity and impurity. This is a major biblical concept. Tamei, tahor. Tamei, impure. Tahor, pure. What is impurity and what is purity? It's certainly not a matter of hygiene. It's not a matter of being dirty or whatever it is. It's a spiritual concept. But you have to understand, there are many, many different things that are tamei. There is contact with a dead body, that's tamei. There is also contact with dead animals that convey a certain level of tumah. I don't mean slaughtered animals. If you eat a hamburger, you're not tamei. In other words, unless it's a treif hamburger, meaning any animal that is properly ritually slaughtered does not convey tumah. But dead animals that are not ritually slaughtered do convey tumah. You don't need Parah Aduma for that, but you are tamei for at least one day. So we have the tumah of human corpses. We have the tumah of dead animals. We have the tumah of menstruation. A woman that menstruates is a tamei. A man with a seminal emission is tamei. We have the tumah of childbirth. A woman after childbirth is tamei. A leper, one with sarat, is tamei. In all of these cases, we have a label called tamei and purification rituals. Is there any common denominator between all of these different categories that are called tamei? So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says there is a common denominator. All of them involve contact with death. Now some of these are not obvious. That whenever we are connected to death, we enter a state called tamei. Now, some of the tumos are obviously connected with death. Touching a dead body, touching a dead animal. Even menstruation is connected to death because the shedding of a uterine lining was potentially a pregnancy that could have taken place. A seminal emission is a form of death because potentially this could have created a child. What about childbirth? Right? A woman after childbirth was ritually tamei till she brought sacrifices. Childbirth doesn't seem to be connected to death. It seems to be connected to life. Well, Rav Hirsch says, maybe you'll buy this, maybe not, that even childbirth is a form of death because it's the death of a life that was within the woman's body. It's been externalized, but something had died within her. It's no longer here within her. So, point number one is, tumah happens, exclusion from the temple basically, when I come in contact with death in its many forms. Now, why is that so? So let's go back to the origin of death. Adam and Eve were supposed to live forever. Immortality was God's original plan. Because of the sin of eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and of course what that sin is a huge, difficult topic, God decreed that death would come into the world. Now it's true, Adam lived a long life, 930 years, is nothing to sneeze at, but we lost the level of immortality because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas. And the second consequence of that chait, which is actually connected, is we were expelled from the Garden of Eden. The two consequences that occurred as a result of the chait of the Eitz Hadas was the expulsion from Eden, the ideal world, and the introduction of death, mortality, including things like the pain of childbirth and the like. So, what that means is, every time we encounter death, we are reconnecting, we are re-experiencing ourselves to the sin of the eating of the tree of knowledge. And the same way that when we sinned, we were expelled from the Garden of Eden, whenever we reenact or re-experience the chait of the Eitz Hadas, we have to re-experience the symbolic expulsion from the Garden of Eden. What is the equivalent of the Garden of Eden on earth? It is the temple. That's why I'm saying being tamei does not impact most of your life. Meaning, you go to shul, you learn Torah, you daven, you wear tefillin, you keep Shabbos. The fact that I'm tamei doesn't make me a pariah. After all, we're all in the same boat. But the one thing that being tamei does impose on me is it kicks me out of the Beit HaMikdash until I undergo purification rituals. So you see why? Because death came because of the sin of the Eitz Hadas. The sin resulted in expulsion from Eden. Therefore, every time I'm connected to death, which came because of that sin, I get re-expelled from the Garden of Eden, and the earthly Garden of Eden is indeed the Temple of Jerusalem. Yeah.
Is it death exposed only from a human or like an animal?
So the answer is even animal death. Now it's a different severity, meaning the following. When I come in contact with a human corpse, I am tameh for 7 days, and I need the ritual of Parah Aduma plus mikvah. When I touch a dead animal, I am only tameh for 1 day, and all I need to do is go to the mikvah, and I do not need the ritual of Parah Aduma. So there are differences in the technical halachot, but the concept of tuma, including denial of access to the temple for that day, does apply to animal tuma as well. Again, let me remind you, if an animal was halachically slaughtered, it does not have the status of tuma. That's why you can. That's why if you eat kosher meat, you're not ritually tameh because of that. Yeah.
You said if you get in contact with a human body, you're tomei for 7 days.
If it's dead, a dead body, yeah.
Does that mean you could just wait 7 days? You're not
No. So let me explain what this means. You're tameh for 7 days, but and then you have to engage in purification rituals like the ashes of the Parah Aduma. Meaning, if you don't have the purification rituals, you're tameh forever. That goes back to my earlier point. All of us are tameh today because if we've ever been in a cemetery, we have the tumah, and even though more than 7 days have passed, we haven't had the purification rituals. Okay, so tumah never goes off by itself. When I say it's 7 days, 1 day, that presupposes you then do the purification rituals. Without the purification rituals, it stays forever. Same thing with the woman, menstruation, nida. Even if it's been 20 years since a woman had her period, if she hadn't gone to the mikveh, she remains prohibited to her husband. That's why even postmenopausal women who are not having their periods, if they had not gone to the mikveh, they must go to the mikveh to be able to be with their husbands. Yeah.
I understand one of the consequences of being tameh is our expulsion from the Beis Hamikdash, the Garden of Eden. Are there also physical consequences or consequences to our neshama of staying tameh? And is it the same type of tameh that one receives from scratching their hair, touching their shoes?
Okay, so these are good questions. The truth is the word tameh is used in many, many different consequences. So, for example, when you scratch your hair, we talk about your hands being tameh, that you got to wash them. But that doesn't mean your whole person is tameh. I mean, that's a limited type of tumah. The tumos we're talking about are tumos that affect the whole body. Now the question is there some spirit, meaning halachically you can't go to the temple. Okay, is that just a halachic rule, or is there some diminution in your spirituality? Meaning, is tumah a spiritual reality of distancing from God, or is tumah an operational behavioral construct? Meaning the following. Tumah does have rules. I'm tameh, I can't go to the temple. Is it just that? Meaning tumah is nothing more than a label that says, thou shalt not go to the temple? Or is it reflective of some spiritual blemish of the soul that is the reason why I don't go to the temple? Now, you're right, there's some practical differences here, meaning, let's assume, today I don't have purification anyway, but let's assume we had purification, but I happen not to live near the temple, I happen not be planning to go to the temple. Is there anything wrong with maintaining a state of tumah as long as I'm not violating the laws of a person that's tameh? If you looked at tumah as nothing more than a label of halachic activities that you can or cannot do, then intrinsically there's nothing wrong with being tameh, except for a Kohen. Kohen is not allowed, but if I'm not a Kohen, there's nothing wrong with it. If, on the other hand, you look at it as a kind of spiritual blockage or impediment, then even if I'm not even going to go to the temple, it's not a state I would want to maintain if it's possible. So that's an excellent question, really. And there seems to be a machlokas. The Rambam seems to indicate, maybe from a more rational perspective, that tumah is simply a halachic behavioral label and is not a I hope I'm not too highfalutin here, but it's not a metaphysical essence. So, as long as you obey the rules, you're perfectly free to be tamei. Be as tamei as much as you want, no problem. Just be sure you don't go to the temple. Mystically, it's viewed in a very different way. Mystically, it's viewed as a state of distancing from God, which unfortunately all of us are undergoing because we're tamei, and therefore, if you can get yourself out of it, you try to get yourself out of it as much as you can. So there are two ways of looking at it. You are correct, yeah.
Thank you. A child who goes into an abattoir, they have no sense of what's going on. They just see that it's horrible murder and mayhem, and they assume that people running the slaughterhouse are evil. And
Yeah.
this is awful. And this is a terrible place. An adult goes into an abattoir, and it's not pretty, it's not good, but he understands this is keeping people from starving. He understands the greater good that's generated. So, with the knowledge of good and evil, maybe there was a sense that a being with imperfect knowledge got a glimpse into creation of an element of it that they weren't ready to understand yet, and on its own, in its worst aspect, implied a fault on Hashem's part, and that would distance that person from them in of themselves, that they somehow thought that maybe the Creator had some kind of cruelty in them, and that was only because they didn't have the imperfect picture. They didn't have the perfect picture of how everything was aligning.
Mm-hmm.
And so that it's in our das, we have something that naturally distances us from Hashem. And when we run into a dead body, we see it as something cruel and awful, and we don't understand it. And so that does it to us every time we encounter it.
Yeah, that's interesting, that every time we encounter death, which by definition is seemingly an imperfection or a defect in some ideal plan, if one is not living at a heightened reality of a true understanding, one sees a fault, one sees a defect in God, and that itself generates the distance or the expulsion, so to speak, once again from the Garden of Eden, which represents the temple. It's a good point. Yeah.
Is there a reason? Can you discuss why Kohen couldn't become ritually pure? Is it like, so when Mashiach comes, that at least there will be at least one person
Right.
pure? That
Yeah. Yeah. So this is important. In other words, let me just make the obvious point. It is not prohibited for a non-Kohen to go to a funeral. In fact, it's a mitzvah, etc. But the one person who is not allowed, even today, to come in contact with the dead is the Kohen, the person that is descended from Aharon. And these are problems. Even you'd be amazed at how intricate these laws are. There are even problems of airplanes. You know, a lot of El Al flights carry bodies from America to be buried in Israel. A Kohen is not allowed to be on a flight with a dead body because he's under the same roof as the dead body. So, and since the airlines don't know, they really don't have a lot of advance notice when they're going to carry a dead body, but they have policies. Allah will notify people, Cohanim, that there's going to be sometimes you'll already be at the airport. You're a Kohen, you're already at the airport. And say, sorry, you can't take this flight. There's a dead body on the flight. But not only that, not only is there a problem when there's a dead body on the airplane, there's even a problem when the plane flies over a cemetery. The plane might be 30,000 feet above a cemetery. But the way Tuma works is it's like a vertical line. You could be 10 miles above it, hits the plane, and goes in. I know, I'll give you a little answer in a second. I just want to tell you a little more information. Now, you may have seen the picture. It really is the funniest picture, and halachically it's so intricate, about a guy was sitting on El Al, and he was wrapped in a plastic transparent bag. Did you see that picture? He's just sitting in a bag. What I love is, I love it that the guy he's sitting next to is just reading a newspaper. Like it's kind of amazing. Just sitting next to a guy in a plastic bag. And the concept of that was, again, it's very intricate, that there are ways of blocking the tumah, that you're under the same roof, but you're in a self-contained bubble, and there are different rules about blocking. It's very complicated stuff. What substances can be blockers, what can't be blockers? Are you allowed to have air holes? Does it have to be totally like airtight? Can you have some holes in it? But, okay, so Cohanim have to worry about this. Cohanim have to worry about dead bodies in the plane. Cohanim have to worry about flying over cemeteries. Cohanim have to determine what's an appropriate blocker. And Cohanim generally cannot go to funerals unless they stand away, at the other side of the fence or whatever it is. Now the question is why? Why does the Torah make a big deal that because you're a Kohen? So the simplest reason is that when there was a Beis HaMikdash, Kohanim had to be ready for duty. Now since being Tameh means at a minimum can't serve in the temple, at least for a week, so Kohanim had to be, ready. And even today we believe in the hope of Mashiach. We hope the rebuilding of the temple will be speedy. So the simplest idea might be that readiness for temple duty. Now, I once saw another explanation that was very, very interesting. It sounds so modern and political, and that is that in times of, Kohanim are the spiritual leaders, and their job is to counsel, their job is to advise, and people are most vulnerable at times of bereavement and death. So there actually was a fear that spiritual leaders would take advantage of people in their most vulnerable moments, and therefore the Kohen specifically said, keep away from bereavement, keep away from death, and in that way you will not abuse your position. Now that's a very modern idea. It was not said by any classical commentary I'm aware of, but it was suggested, and it is interesting in terms of abuse of power to bring that in. Yeah.
But technically now a bunch of Kohens are Tamei, no?
Yes. So that's a very interesting point. Given the fact that everybody is tummy, including Kohens, so the question is, just like you can't become more pregnant if a woman's already pregnant, can you become more tummy? Meaning today, if I'm a Kohen, I'm already tummy. Is there anything wrong with, going to a funeral? So the Ravid, Rav Avram ben David, who was a great commentator who always argues with the Rambam, the Ravid actually says that in a time when you're already tamei, there is no prohibition for a Kohen to get re-tamei, because you're already tamei. So there is such a view, but the halacha says not. The halacha says that every contact with the dead is a new offense. So even if you're ritually impure from the past, you're still not allowed to do it again. So there is an interesting debate about that. Yeah.
If a Kohen is impure, but he becomes a Baal Teshuvah, does he still remain pure? Or?
No. I mean, if he's impure, now the only thing is, I guess, let me just mention, non-Jews, interestingly enough, do not become ritually impure. Tuma, impurity, is a category that applies only to Jewish people, interestingly enough. So as a result, if a non-Jew was in contact with the dead and he then converted, he would not be impure, because his only contact with the dead body was as a non-Jew. But if he was Jewish and was in contact with the dead, he's ritually impure, so doing tshuva is not going to change that. He'll still have to live with that consequence. Yeah.
There's a Kohen that never went to a cemetery, never had contact with the dead his whole life. Would he be admitted access to the HaRav, or him being in contact with somebody who was in contact would deny him access? Yeah. So the truth is, it is very complicated. There is primary tuma. I had direct contact with the dead, but then there's a concept that if I was in contact with the dead and I touch you, you can become tamei as well. But the thing is, you don't need Parah Aduma for that, and therefore you could go to the mikveh and you would be tar. So l'chayr that would be possible. Meaning, even if initially you have secondary tumah, that secondary tumah could be removed today. The primary tumah couldn't be removed. But I think the problem is, operationally, you can't have a practice where some people are told they're allowed to go and some people are not, because that's going to be so confusing. Like, you go and I can't go, and So it's not really possible to do that. So they say nobody should go. Yeah.
To go back onto the rules, you mentioned that with humans it's 7 days and with animals it's
1 day. Yeah.
Isn't logically it would make sense in reverse, because humans, it's a higher level, so you
Yeah.
have to quickly go and purify yourself?
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me just explain that this also will explain the idea of why is Tuma for Jews and not for non-Jews. The concept is this. Tuma, in the form of death, represents a vacuum, an emptiness. The greater the holiness when there was life, the greater the vacuum and emptiness that's created when there's death. So a dead human is more tamei than a dead animal because there was greater sanctity, there was greater holiness. So therefore, there is more that was lost with the death. You know, the death of an animal is also a loss. You have a pet especially, right? So we recognize that animals have a role in the world, either in a practical way or an emotional way, whatever it would be, but their loss is not as significant as the loss of a human being. And therefore, the impurity that comes as a result of that loss is not going to be as severe as the impurity that comes with the loss of a human being. Yeah.
So I have two questions. The first is, if your mother is telling when she's pregnant with you and then you're born, does that automatically transfer to you? And the second is, you said that there might be a concept that when we're Tomei, we're more distant from God.
Yes.
What is it, like, in a metaphysical sense, but also in a practical sense? What does it actually mean? Are we less understanding or less ability to connect?
Yeah. So again, what would it mean? Okay. So your first question. First of all, it's important. A baby in the womb does not contract any impurity from its mother, no matter what. The only issue is when it's born, to the degree that it touches the mother from the outside, it would get the tumor at that point. And there may be a way of delivering the baby by forceps or whatever, in which there was no touching, you know, so it's theoretically possible, but there is no tumor contracted in the womb itself. In terms of what does it mean to talk about the spiritual defect of tumor, you know, I don't really know. Presumably one of the manifestations would be a diminished understanding of God, meaning you just don't have the same clarity you would have if you would be in a state of purity. It's hard for us to understand because all of us are in the state of impurity, so we have this cloudiness, so to speak, that perhaps would not exist in that more ideal state. Yeah.
So if a Cohen becomes impure, are they no longer a Cohen?
Oh, okay. No. So very good. Very important. If a Cohen is impure, he has violated his laws of kahuna, of priesthood, but he's still a Cohen. He committed a sin. I mean, let me give you a more extreme example. A Cohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. That's a halacha. If a Cohen marries a divorced woman, he's still a Cohen.
He can't serve.
He can't serve because as a punishment. Now, what's interesting is, although this is taking me far afield, the child that he has from that divorced woman is not a Cohen. So in a sense, the child suffers for the parent's sin. I married the divorced woman, I'm the sinner, I'm still a Cohen. My kid, no longer a Cohen. Which is why, by the way, this is important to know this, depending on family circumstances, people who identify as Cohen or Katz or Kaplan, these are Cohen's names, may not always be Cohanim, even if their ancestors are Cohanim, because there could have been something like that happening in the past, which breaks the line. That's why the DNA test is not good. You know, there's a DNA test that can show that you are a male descendant of Aaron. I don't know exactly how they can do that, but they can do that. So the question becomes, is that acceptable halachic proof that I'm a Cohen? The answer is no. First of all, I'll give you a simple case. Let's say my father, the Cohen, marries a goy, a non-Jewish woman. So I have the genetic marker, I'm not even Jewish. And certainly, even if I am Jewish, you know, divorced women, etc. So the most you can say is, it could negate Cohen, maybe, meaning if I don't have it, perhaps that's proof I'm not a Cohen. If I do have it, it can't prove anything, right? You can't prove it. It's a false, it's what they call a true negative, maybe, and a false positive. Yeah.
In the case where the Torah makes an obligation on us to go at a funeral to visit to see our family and to bury them and so on, are we tamei from that? And in a situation where a Cohen, I know there's like a very rare case, I forget the exact relationship, is to go. A Cohen, does he choose not to go to that now today because that law was given at a time when Hashem offered the ability to purify?
Well, first of all, let me point out that even a Kohen does go to the funeral. Right. Even a Kohen, father, mother, brother, sister, wife, son and daughter. So a Kohen does go to those funerals, and he's halachically, according to many opinions, it's a mitzvah. He's obligated to do so. Only a Kohen Gadol, which we don't have today, the high priest, is so extra strict, he doesn't even go to the funeral of a close relative. But can a Kohen choose what to not keep the laws of impurity?
Well, I'm wondering that now today when we don't have Parah, the law and all of those strictures that were given were at a time when, fine, the Kohen had a leniency to go and become Tameh for this Kiyum, but now because he has no way to purify himself, which was present when the obligation was created, is there a way to say that he actually doesn't go nowadays?
No, because he still has obligations towards his family. By the way, I want to mention now the famous Chafetz. So actually, I didn't finish what I wanted to talk about, but Baruch Hashem, that way I can say it Friday night. I was worried, what am I going to say Friday night? So I'm going to give you part 2 Friday night, so we're okay. I'm very happy. Thank you for the digressions, taking me off track. Anyway, the thing is that I just want to end with a very cute story. You know, the great Chafetz Chaim, the great sage, the Chafetz Chaim, was a Kohen. He died in 1933. And obviously he couldn't go into a cemetery. So he had a daughter in his second marriage towards the end of his life. She was born when he was already very old, and she only died a few years ago, and she wrote about what an affectionate father he was. He was really a wonderful parent, in addition to being a great tzaddik. But sometimes, you know, he was so righteous that for a little kid it was a little tough. So she said, when she needed to get away from her dad sometimes. So she used to go and play in the town cemetery in Radin, because a woman, a Bas Kohen, is allowed to go to a cemetery. So she knew that Abba couldn't come after her in the cemetery. So she said, a lot of kids are afraid to walk into a cemetery at night. You know, they get superstitious or whatever. But she said that was her favorite place because she knew she had privacy there. Okay, we'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.